this video, we will be talking about the architecture in Snowflake. So how does the underlying architecture work? What is a data warehouse? And what are the main technologies that are used in Snowflake so that we understand what makes Snowflake unique? So let's dive right in. When we want to understand the architecture in Snowflake, we need to understand the three distinct independent layers in Snowflake. This is very important in regards to the architecture. So first of all, we have the first independent layer, which is the database storage. And here, of course, the data is stored. Then we have the second independent layer, which is the compute layer, or also called query processing layer. This consists of so-called virtual warehouses. They provide the compute resources to execute our queries. And then lastly, we have the so-called cloud services layer. This is also called the brain of the system, because in here all of the threads come together and all of the different components and activities are managed. But now we want to dive a bit deeper into each of those layers. First of all, we have the database storage layer. As mentioned, this is decoupled from the compute. And this is a so-called hybrid columnar storage. So in here, this means we compress the data into so-called blobs. Those will be then stored in an external cloud provider. For example, it can be AWS S3 buckets or Azure containers. And of course, we don't get those blobs. So those blobs are like data files and we don't really see them. We don't need to be concerned with them. But in the end, of course, we want to retrieve data as columns and rows in a table. This is what we are used to in a database. And of course, Snowflake manages all aspects about the data so that we can just run very simple SQL queries on the databases, on the tables, and we can just very simply retrieve the data as if it would be really nice tables with columns and rows. And with this columnar storage, we get not only very efficient data storage, but we get also a very high performance. So this is a very modern technology that is optimized for analytical purposes. So it's not used in OLTP databases, so transactional databases where we have a lot of write operations, but we want to read the data. So we want to quickly make analysis and get the data out of the database. This is what this layer is optimized for. So we have the so-called compressed columnar storage. And then we have also the second layer, which is now responsible to process all of the queries. This is the query processing layer. This is also called the muscle of the system because this is where we get the compute resources to process all of those queries. And we use virtual warehouses for this. A virtual warehouse, short also just warehouse, is a massive parallel processing compute cluster. Again, we use resources from the cloud provider. So if this is AWS, we use so-called EC2 instances, or for Azure, we use Azure virtual machines. And these clusters can be made up by, for example, one single node, or we can also have multiple of those nodes. So they will be clustered together into one cluster, and then they can be used together to process more powerfully. And this is now giving us all of the compute power that is needed to process and execute the queries. And now we also have the last layer. This is the cloud services layer, where now all of the different components come together. And therefore, this is also called the brain of the system. This is basically just a collection of services that coordinate and manage the different components and services together. Of course, we also need some compute power for this, and this is again provided by the cloud provider of our choice. So if it's again Azure, we for example have Azure virtual machines, but this is actually not so relevant for us because it's happening all behind the scenes and Snowflake managed this layer completely. So we have really no influence on this. What is important though is what this cloud service layer is doing. This is what we need to remember. So for example, when we log into our account, the authentication is going through this cloud service layer. And then we are authenticated, we can log in. Also the access control, if we have different roles with different permissions, this will also be managed completely by the cloud services. Also, Snowflake stores metadata and gathers different statistics about our objects, about our queries, and all of this metadata management is happening in the cloud services layer. It is important to know that the query execution, the query processing, is happening, of course, in the compute layer, but the query parsing and query optimization is done in the cloud service layer. So this directs then the query to the compute layer, and this is also done by the cloud services. So query parsing and query optimization in the cloud services layer, and query execution, the actual query processing, is happening, of course, in the compute layer. And also the infrastructure management is done by the cloud service layer. So you can see that this is where all of the threads come together, and this is why it's called the brain of the system. Authentication, access control, metadata management, query parsing and optimization, and infrastructure management. Very important to remember, this is the cloud services layer.